Welcome to Learn at Work, a webinar series presented by the journal Work, a journal of profession, assessment, and rehabilitation. I'm Karen Jacobs, the founding editor of Work, and I want to do a shout out to iOS Press, the publisher of Work, for their support in this webinar series. So I'm delighted to introduce our two speakers. They're going to give you some background about themselves and then get started on their presentation. So welcome.
Hi, everybody. I am Desiree Kramer, and I was the principal investigator and co-principal investigator on the three studies that we are going to be talking about, and wrote the three grants, which included the idea of evaluating our partnerships with stakeholders on the three research studies. When we decided to amalgamate the three research projects together and evaluate the partnerships of all three projects, I then passed it on to Emily Haynes, and she was the one who did the interviews, did the analysis, and did the whole evaluation. So actually, for the rest of the presentation, I'm handing it over to Emily.
Thanks, Desiree. So hi, everyone. My name is Emily Haynes. And as Desiree said, I did the interviews and the analysis on this project that we will be presenting today. At the time of this project, I was working with Desiree at the Occupational Cancer Research Center as a research associate doing qualitative research with her. And currently I am in Halifax, Nova Scotia right now, and I'm a second-year medical student at Dalhousie University. So let's get started. So the title of this presentation, as you can read, is With a Little Help from Our Friends, Elements of Strong Partnerships in Collaborative Research Projects. So I'm going to start off by giving a little bit of a background on where this study came from and the studies on which this study is based comes from. So these were all based out of the Occupational Cancer Research Center, and it's also called the OCRC. So the OCRC is based at Cancer Care Ontario, and its research focuses on the causes and prevention of occupational cancer. The OCRC is a unique partnership that unites research, healthcare, workplace safety, labor, and industry groups. It's jointly funded by Cancer Care Ontario, the Ontario Ministry of Labour, and the Canadian Cancer Society, and it was developed in collaboration with the United Steelworkers. The centre is housed at Cancer Care Ontario, as I said, and it's led by Dr. Paul Demers, who's the director there, and it's supported by a steering committee. The research projects at OCRC often involve partnerships with other researchers, policymakers, and practitioners, and the projects focus on understanding the causes of occupational cancer and evidence-based ways to prevent it. So if you're interested in learning more about the OCRC, the website's there at the bottom, www.occupationalcancer.ca. And next I want to give a little bit of background on integrated knowledge translation, or IKT. So this is research that includes the eventual knowledge users in the whole research process. So what that means is, say for example, in one of our projects, Sun Safety at Work Canada, we included organizations, practitioners, and policymakers who would eventually be the ones who would be tasked with disseminating our research findings out to workplaces broadly. And we included them in the entire research process, from developing the grant through to recruiting workplaces, collecting data, developing knowledge products, and then disseminating those knowledge products. Integrated knowledge translation has big promises. So it's thought that integrated knowledge translation research projects have partners that are more likely to define relevant questions and then put those findings into practice. And funding agencies like CIHR strongly support or even require these types of research partnerships. CIHR is the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, and it's one of the major funding bodies in Canada for health research. So CIHR defines IKT as an approach to doing research that applies the principles of knowledge translation to the entire research process. The central premise of IKT is that involving knowledge users as equal partners alongside with researchers will lead to research that is more relevant to and more likely to be useful to the knowledge users. Each stage in the research process is an opportunity for significant collaboration with knowledge users, including the development or refinement of the research questions, selection of methodology, data collection and tools development, selection of outcome measures, interpretation of the findings, crafting of the message, and dissemination of the results. So, although integrated knowledge translation research projects are highly sought after, there have been a few attempts to evaluate such partnerships and determine what actually makes an effective research practice policy partnership in doing and creating knowledge. Okay, so the research project that I'm going to describe here today can be thought of as a kind of like a meta project. So it's research on research. So what it was a project that was looking to evaluate the integrated knowledge translation partnerships that were present during these 3 studies here. Okay, so these were the 3 studies that we evaluated in this study: the burden of occupational cancer, otherwise known as BURDEN, Sun Safety at Work Canada, and completing the picture. So the first thing I'm going to do is just give an overview of these 3 projects and what they attempted to do, first of all. So the burden of occupational cancer was a 4-year study, and the partner was the Canadian Cancer Society Ontario Division. There were 17 researchers from 7 institutions, and the main research objective was to estimate the number of cancer cases and cancer deaths that can be attributed to workplace exposure to carcinogenic events and the economic impact in order to identify priority areas for prevention. So this was largely an epidemiological study, and if you want to learn more about each of these 3 studies, I've put a link just below the title there that you can go to learn more about these studies. So that's the burden page on the Occupational Cancer Research Centre website. The next one was Sun Safety at Work Canada. And this one was a 1.5-year study that involved multiple partner organizations. So the Canadian Dermatology Association, Canadian Cancer Society, SunSafe Nova Scotia Coalition, Occupational Health Nurses Association of Nova Scotia, WorkSafe BC, Carex Canada, and Alberta Health Services. So this study was a national study, and so was Burden as well. It was a national study. The number of researchers on this study was 5, hailing from 4 different institutions. And the question was, can a multi-implementation, multi-evaluation approach help develop sustainable workplace-specific programs, policies, and procedures to increase the use of UV safety and heat protection? And again, the website that you can learn more about this project is up at the top here. This is actually one of the knowledge products that was created from this research, this website. And it was created with significant input from our practice and policymaker partners that were part of this project. The final one is completing the picture. So this was a 3-year study, and the partners were the Occupational Health Clinics for Ontario Workers and the Public Services Health and Safety Association. There were 6 researchers from 4 institutions, and its question was, is it feasible to ask patients about their work exposure during primary care visits at health centres in Ontario? And again, the link is there. So this project was a provincial project. Okay, so as I have tried to explain, the research study that we're presenting today is an evaluation of those 3 partnerships, of those 3 research projects. So from June 2015 to May 2016, I completed 20 face-to-face interviews. Desiree completed one of those interviews. With 22 participants. So they were individual interviews except for one, which was a 2 participants to 1 interviewer. The participants were from the 3 research projects. 2 of them were classified as policymakers, 17 were classified as practitioners, and 2 of them were classified as both policymaker and practitioner. They had both roles. The analysis was done through thematic coding and in vivo 10, and a framework analysis was undertaken. So for those who might not be familiar with qualitative research, thematic coding is a way in which parts of text are highlighted and codes are attached to them, and then these codes can be collated and collated into larger themes that eventually show the findings of the study. The secondary analysis that we did with this was the framework analysis method. So once we had our codes and we were able to use deductive and inductive coding, we then did a framework analysis using these deductive and inductive codes, and we compared them across the 3 projects. And that was a way that we could organize and better organize our findings and kind of see the differences between the 3 projects. I mentioned deductive and inductive coding. So what that means is deductive codes are generally codes that are chosen before you begin the coding process. So maybe they are things that you've explicitly asked about in your interview guide, but most oftenly and most importantly, they're often things that are located in your original conceptual framework, which I'll talk about in a second. Inductive coding is allowing codes to emerge from the data. So going through the data, you start to see differing themes, and you start to attach new codes. And through this process of deductive and inductive coding, you can really get a great idea of what's going on with your data. And as I alluded to, we had a conceptual model that was informed throughout the study, and it evolved throughout the study as well. So this is our conceptual framework. It looks a little bit blurry to me, so I'm sorry if it looks a little bit blurry to you. This is our final conceptual model, but it has evolved, and it did evolve throughout the study. So we originally based it upon a conceptual model that was done by Gagliardi and her colleagues in 2016, and that framework was called Analysis of the Preconditions, Approaches, Enablers, and Barriers that Lead to Successful Outcomes for Integrated Knowledge Transfer. So that conceptual framework was based on a scoping review of the literature, and in that model, they included all of the enablers and barriers, all of the conditions, the IKT approaches, and the outcomes that they had found in the literature. So we thought that this was an excellent model to use for our study because it gave us kind of the broadest look at all of the factors that we might have to consider in our study. And from that model, we developed an interview guide, and as we came to learn, as interviews progressed, and as we came to learn more and more about our research question, the conceptual framework evolved into eventually what you see here in front of you. So what this is saying is that there are enablers and barriers such as capacity, project management, role, having the right partners involved, etc., that influence the approach that is going to be taken to integrated knowledge translation. Maybe there's going to be evidence briefs developed. Maybe there's just going to be consultations to share the knowledge. Maybe there's priority setting going on. And there's also conditions that influence the IKT approach as well. So how involved was everybody in the research process? Are the partners able to invest in the project? Do the partners want to invest in the project? And all these come together to produce these outcomes. And these outcomes, you'll notice, look very similar to the promises that CIHR makes of integrated knowledge translation, that the research is more relevant, it's of higher quality. The researchers and the practitioners learn about each other's worlds and how the other one works day to day, accessing each other's contacts and information, actually using the research in practice and policy making, disseminating, diffusing the research, developing trust and goodwill, and then eventually continued collaboration on new projects, which has been very important for the OCRC. So I'm going to begin now with presenting some of our results. And I want to present first the enablers of collaborative research projects. And in the paper, we've defined the barriers as the opposite of these things, or not having such things. So these are the things I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to provide supportive quotes as well. So enablers of collaborative research projects include having adequate capacity, defined project roles, having the right partners involved, having an inclusive project leader, mutual respect, good communication, and shared values and priorities. So adequate capacity, and you'll see here, before I get started, I've got the enablers and barriers square here, and this is just to highlight again the importance of having a conceptual framework defining your research project, because not only does it help you throughout the whole research process, but it helps you to report the results as well. So you'll see parts of the conceptual framework throughout the reporting of the results. So having adequate capacity. I always like to be more involved, but it's always a question of workload. So I like to hear lots about the research, but I understand it's not our primary role. So this is a quote that illustrates the idea that the research partners, it is not their primary job, or they're not their primary job to do research all day, whereas for the researchers, that is their bread and butter. That's what they do every day. So with the practice partners, this sometimes, being a partner on the research project, sometimes was done off the side of their desk. And what ended up helping them be able to engage more meaningfully in the research process was having a dedicated staff person, or having dedicated money to hire a dedicated staff person, so that they would have the participation in the project within their mandate. There was also one partner during the time of their study that was going through some significant changeover, and this became a big issue for them as well, because originally money had been earmarked for this exact process that I just spoke about, having money to hire someone whose job it was to act as the liaison between that organization and the research project. But because that organization was undergoing such change at the time, they were not able to necessarily guarantee this. Define project roles. Well, I think it's very nice to partner with organizations who will stick to their scope. Having people who perform different roles in a partnership is the way it should be, and it's nice to be able to collaborate and share. But having clearly defined, this is what we're going to do and this is what we would like to do, is, I think, the best case scenario. So this quote, I think, highlights a very important point to consider with the CIHR definition of what integrated knowledge translation is and what it's supposed to do. We heard from our research partners quite clearly that they were not necessarily interested in engaging in every aspect of the research process. And this is related to capacity as well, but you know, the research partners, especially when it comes to maybe choosing a research methodology, or the nitty-gritty data analysis and the expertise that comes with people who are researchers and have that skill set and are, you know, have a degree in epidemiology or have a degree in health promotion and have done qualitative research every day. The research partners didn't necessarily have that level of skill and that level of expertise to engage in that part of the process. And so although they thought that it would be nice to learn a little bit about it, when they considered their competing priorities of their day-to-day job and the reason that, you know, they go to work every day, it wasn't really high on their list for them to be involved in every single aspect on the project. And on the flip side, they were very interested in contributing where they felt their strengths lied. So if a research partner felt like, you know, part of their organizational role had to do with social media, they really wanted to be involved in the project's social media campaign and developing messaging and making sure that messaging was aligned. And similarly, if people had expertise with developing a project website or developing websites or were tech savvy or anything like that, they really wanted to contribute that resource to the project. Okay, so having the right partners involved. There's a lot of turnover happening in the NGO sector. Who maintains that relationship, that contact? How do you transfer projects when somebody leaves? If that position is not being replaced immediately, when that person leaves, how are they transferring that project to somebody else? So again, this speaks to what I was talking about before with changeover in the NGO sector, and having that dedicated person and the dedicated resources there to make sure that the partner's participation in the project continues forward. But also what this theme spoke to was the idea of making sure the right person at the organization was involved. So we found for the most case, there was a appropriate lineup between who that partner was and what their role was in that organization and what their level of power was in that organization and what their role was supposed to be on the project. Sometimes we had great lineup of those two things and sometimes we didn't. So for example, if we are engaging an organization because we really want them to throw their weight around and to really do some great advocacy work, we want to make sure that we engage someone who is high enough up in that organization, who's able to make those kinds of decisions, and who has that role within their mandate in their organization anyway. If we want someone who is more of a technical skill, say like developing a website or recruiting health and safety associations, that kind of thing, then we want to make sure that we are engaging a person in that organization who has that technical skill in their daily role anyway. I think that's all I want to say about that. Okay. So the next thing is having an inclusive project leader. Going into the project, we pretty much had established the relationship in my view. I was very familiar with your work, with the type of people that you were, your passion for it. Of course, we're going to at every opportunity partner with you guys. So this is an example of someone who was really positive about the relationship and the project leadership. And I could definitely tell that there was one project leader in particular who, by virtue of who he was and how engaging and thoughtful and how thoughtful he was, it really brought people in and made people who had never really gotten to know each other face to face feel really great and included, and like their input mattered in the project. We definitely had some feedback that project leadership could have improved in terms of making sure everybody knew what was going on and that kind of thing. And so we definitely heard things both ways. And just having that inclusive project leader really helped to steer the ship. And I found that if there were things that were potentially about to go off the road, having the inclusive project leader really was able to right the ship, if you will. Mutual respect. Sometimes the materials would be sent the morning of a meeting or the day before, which did not really offer a lot of time to review and be able to provide useful input. Sometimes that comes across as, okay, we are working on this and we do not really want your input, but here it is. And I know that is likely not the case, but that is certainly how it can be perceived. So mutual respect was very important in many of these working relationships. And as this quote highlights, simple things can speak volumes to partners, and you never really know how people are going to perceive it. So this was an example of one of the projects where people were talking over the phone and didn't really get to meet face to face very often. And it really went a long way in this interviewee's eyes to make sure that steps are taken to demonstrate respect and organization. What this construct also talked about was the idea that through working on the research project together, people were able to build a mutual respect for the constraints that they experience in their daily lives. So the constraints that a researcher might experience in terms of how long things take or what the expertise is and that sort of thing. But also on the flip side of the partners, developing a respect for knowing what they really need in their work. So for example, one of the project partners talked about how researchers would provide a huge backgrounder of information, and the partner would be like, okay, I'm just going to take these 1 or 2 sound bites and that's it. And so they thought that the researchers really learned something about how things work in the practice world as well. And then good communication. Sometimes it's really hard to tell what people are actually feeling about a thing. I could hear people on the phone saying something, but you kind of get a sense that there's something else going on in the room, or there's a facial expression that you can't pick up on. I always save my really nitty-gritty hard questions for when I'm going to see people, because I find it a lot easier to chat things out and you're able to read people and see what they really mean. So this is one of my favorite quotes. And this was a quote from one of the research projects where things were done mostly over the telephone. And communication and being on the phone was really a strong theme in that project. In other projects, there was kind of a give and take between feeling that project communication was needed in terms of more project communication was needed, but also the understanding that maybe they didn't have the capacity to engage in more frequent or intensive meetings. And then one of the other projects, there's also the value of informal meetings as well, which were really helpful to keep the project partners on track. There were meetings and that kind of thing that happened for that project. Shared values and priorities. This particular project, it was one that we were absolutely proud to be a part of and felt like it was just giving us more capacity. In fact, it was fulfilling our mandate in a very thoughtful way with very skilled operators. It allowed us to hit the areas we would have liked to be hitting, but just hadn't gotten to. So both the researchers and the practitioners, it was very important that both of them had the same goal. It's just they were working at different aspects of the system. The researchers are working at the knowledge generation aspect of knowledge translation, whereas the practitioners are the users of knowledge and they're working on the ground trying to achieve a goal. So in this case, the goals are generally to decrease incidence and exposure to occupational carcinogens and occupational cancers. So the research partners felt that by operating on this kind of project, they were able to act on their company's mandate and one of their company's main goals, but they were able to kind of outsource that to the researchers and be involved as much or as little as they wanted to. And it was really important that everybody was working towards the same goal. There's been some research done that highlights the importance of or highlights the downfall of starting a research project where the end goal of the two participants, the researchers and the practitioners, do not align. And I would say in the 3 projects that we evaluated here, the end goal or the core values and priorities aligned really well. So that was a really helpful thing. So next I want to talk about some of the outcomes of collaborative research projects. So we have improved relevance and quality of the research findings, enhanced learning about the other's world, enhanced access to other information and contacts, improved use of research in practice and policy, dissemination and diffusion of the research findings, development of trust and goodwill, and continued collaboration on new projects. I've kind of touched on some of these things already. But what we did find in our research, we found all of these outcomes in our 3 research projects. So improved relevance and quality of the research findings. The practitioners were able to provide input on what the research question should be. So for example, in the burden of occupational cancer study, the research partners provided input onto what occupational carcinogens should be studied, because they had the knowledge of their own advocacy work of what was coming up in the political spectrum and what they could really use numbers on, and they could really use that knowledge to advance an agenda. And in that case, it was banning of sale of asbestos in Canada. I've talked about enhanced learning about the other's world, so learning about how researchers operate, how practitioners operate, and kind of respecting respecting the constraints in which the other works. enhance access to other information and contacts. So the practitioners learned a little bit about research and how research works. Those practitioners who aren't embedded in the occupational world, maybe occupational cancer is part of their portfolio, but certainly not all of it. They learned something about occupational cancer and how it's prevented, and occupational health and safety, and all that sorts of things. In the Sun Safety at Work Canada project, partners were really happy to be connected to one another. So in the project involved three provinces across Canada. So it involved Nova Scotia, Ontario, four provinces, Alberta and British Columbia. So the people who were out east and out west, so out east would be Nova Scotia and out west would be Alberta and British Columbia, they really appreciated being connected with each other. And those groups actually ended up forming kind of mini provincial subgroups even after the project ended. So these groups were able to continue to work together on local projects that were basically spin-offs of Sun Safety at Work Canada, even after the project funding ended. And improved use of research and practice and policy. So there were some practice and policy outcomes from the three research projects that we're pretty proud of. So in Sun Safety at Work Canada, the website was developed. There were numerous resources that workplaces, workers, occupational health and safety professionals can use to develop a sun safety program. In the burden of occupational cancer, there was some policy work done. There were multiple dissemination meetings done. And in completing the picture, there was recognition based on the research study findings that the feasibility of asking about workplace exposures in the primary care setting was maybe not there. And so that renewed commitment to include a strategy point in the occupational health strategy to include to work on collecting systematically occupational health exposure data in Ontario. Dissemination and diffusion of research findings, development of trust and goodwill. So relationships were formed, and this goes along with continued collaboration on new research projects. Relationships were built, trust was built, and as I mentioned, people continue to work together, and people do continue to work together today on research. So finally, I just want to talk about some of the lessons that we learned throughout this research process, and we have some recommendations here. So our first one is that researchers and knowledge users should spend time at the beginning of a project partnership outlining their expectations of their roles and involvement. There should be a discussion about making contributions in aspects that are outside of their realms of expertise and the benefits that such an involvement could bring. So like a chance to build capacity and provide input on the results. So because we heard that there was the practitioners had capacity restraints and potentially they had content knowledge or expertise restraints in terms of, for example, knowing how to do quantitative or qualitative analysis, we thought that it's important to have these conversations at the outset of a project, because although integrated knowledge translation purports that the partner should be involved at every part of the process, this might not necessarily be practical. So it's important to have these conversations at the beginning of the project and to be clear and frank about what everybody's role, what everybody wants their role to be, and what their role will be. And one of the other things that I haven't actually talked about is some of the research partners wanted to be involved in more because they wanted to learn. They wanted to learn more about how to do qualitative research. So there should be time spent actually talking about these things. And, you know, if on both sides, if there's any interest in learning a little bit more about something that maybe you haven't had the chance to learn about yet or is outside of your realm of expertise, you should make that clear and maybe include that in your role that you'll play in the research project. Our second recommendation is when considering intermediary organizations to engage as partners, consider these questions. Is this the right time for the organization to invest their time and resources in an IKT partnership? Do they have the time and resources available? So this speaks to the whole capacity aspect, and it speaks to the one organization that was undergoing some structural change at the time of the project. And it's really important to consider these things. And in the real world, you can't anticipate every single thing that's going to happen, especially in the timeline of a multi-year project. But it is really important to consider these things. And if there's one thing I would add to this recommendation, having just reviewed this this stuff for this presentation, it would be to develop a sustainability plan and to kind of have that in mind. And I mean, I can understand how that might be difficult at the time of, you know, writing a grant. That's every time you write a grant and you're trying to get signatures and get people on board and get everybody on the same page, that can be a really busy time. So to add in something else like a sustainability plan might be difficult, but I think that would be worthwhile. So recommendation 3 is to consider the role the partner organization is to play on the project and approach someone within the organization with an appropriate mandate to be the partner. So I spoke to this a little bit before to make sure that if you're looking for someone who you know you want advocacy, you make sure that you find someone in the organization who's able to do that for you. If you want technical expertise, you make sure you find someone in the organization to do that. The fourth recommendation, when considering which organizations to engage as partners, consider these questions. Even if the partners are willing to engage in the project, do they have the commitment to the project? And by this, do we mean how dedicated will the partners be to the project? How involved do they want to be? How do they think their investment of time and resources will reap proportional benefits? Do they think the goals of the project are achievable? And I didn't speak to this very much, but in one of the projects, we found that the engagement from the project partners was a little bit lower than the other two projects. And when considering this and going through the analysis and talking to the people who were involved in the project, it seemed that the partners had been attempting to solve this research question. They had been working on this problem for a long time and had not been successful. And so when this research project came along to assess this problem that they had been working on for a really long time and for which they had been unsuccessful for a very long time, it's possible that they weren't as committed or weren't as into the project as maybe they could have been. And so maybe there was a question of whether, you know, inputting their time is going to actually give them the benefit that they're looking for, and maybe the balance wasn't there for them. That's something that we thought about as a research team through the analysis. So that is pretty much all I have to say. I want to thank all of our research partners who helped create amazing research and create amazing knowledge and disseminate that knowledge in useful and meaningful ways. And we're really proud of all the work that we've been able to do with our partners. The citation for our paper that this presentation is on is at the bottom there for anyone who is interested in learning more.
Well, thank you, Emily and Desiree. It was such an interesting project. You talked about some of the lessons learned, but I'd love you to share any surprises that happened in reflecting now about a year later from the study.
You are using one of my interview techniques.
All right, great.
I'm trying to think about that, Karen. Sorry, it's Desiree speaking. Some of the intermediary partners that were on the studies, I have worked with on numerous projects over, I would even say, longer than decades. Were there any surprises? I think that I didn't realize how important the role of the research leader was and how she could actually break it. So we had, I would say, 4 project leaders for the 3 projects, and some were outstanding and some were mediocre and didn't want to actually cooperate and collaborate at all, and was just doing sort of what was minimally necessary, and somewhere in between. I mean, I think I have to say that I'm in the in-between place. But watching someone who was really, really cooperative and inclusive was an absolute pleasure to watch. So, and I think managed to hold together a Canada-wide project, which, I mean, Canada is so huge and it's nearly so impossible for everyone to get together. And the fact
Like
that the project held together so well.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
Great, thank you. Emily, were you going to say something too?
What surprised me, I like what Desiree said. So I guess one of the things that I've learned from this project most is these things seem pretty straightforward. Like, you need good leadership, you need good communication. But seeing how that can actually go wrong, and how quickly how something very small can be made into something much bigger. So for example, not sending the study materials early enough in time and how that was perceived. So kind of really making sure that you set up your research partnerships and you think things through very carefully, which is hard to do, and obviously you can't anticipate everything. But being really thoughtful about how you set up your research partnership, and then having regular check-ins to make sure that little things don't become big things. Also, what was the other thing? I forgot my other thing.
That's okay. Maybe it'll come back. I have one other question I'd like to ask. What's next? What's next for each of you?
Well, I'll let Emily talk about how now as a medical student she has brought her faculty kicking and screaming to the occupational health and safety field, because she won't let her past, won't let it go. And so I think that Dalhousie University's medical school has now got more occupational health and safety incorporated into the medical school education than it ever had before. I continue to do research with my partners, and I continue to do workplace-based research. I think I'm now working on a project which hopefully will be published and work eventually with 5 union partners and 3 health and safety associations who have been partners in previous research with me. So that was one of the things that was found right in the beginning of the field of knowledge transfer, that the easiest kind of partnership is the one that builds on previous partnerships. And that is so true.
Mhm.
Emily, do you want to take over?
Yeah. So so Desiree kind of talked about what I've been doing. I would say I haven't managed to impact curriculum yet, but I think I have managed to impact the students who are in my class. And I think occupational health is often something that people don't take very seriously. But I tell people you spend like the 2 greatest amount of times you spend in your day are in bed and at work. So these things are important, and I see my future in the next little bit anyway, because I'll be heading into the hospitals next year. Um, I see my next bit is encouraging others to care and ask about occupational exposures, and to take a meaningful history, and to do what they can, because I think that's something Desiree and Rivka and the other people who worked on the Completing the Picture project found, was that there is an element of thought around, well, okay, so if I ask about what people are exposed to, then what? Like, do I ask them to quit their job? What do I ask them to do? So I think there's just an element of encouraging people to ask and to do what they can once they find out the answer. The other so I remembered what I was going to say before about surprise. So one of the things that I think is very important that we found in the study was that um, we have these lofty goals of what integrated knowledge translation is. It's kumbaya. We involve everybody at every part of the project, and that we're going to do amazing things. And while our studies that we evaluated had their issues, I still think that they were able to accomplish amazing things. And people weren't involved at every part of the process for both capacity reasons and practicality reasons and expertise reasons. So there's this give and take between the ideal situation and the practical situation. And I don't necessarily think I don't know how much you're giving up by not doing the ideal situation, but I still think these projects were able to achieve great things.
Oh, thank you both so very much. What you're doing and did with the study is really inspirational, and I can see it rippling as people read your article, and we're so happy to have published it in Work. So any last thoughts before we conclude this Learn at Work webinar?
I think, Karen, I've just got one last thought, and it builds upon what Emily said about how incredibly valuable the outcomes were because we did have the involvement of the partners and the intermediaries. I think fewer and fewer people are doing workplace-based research because the partnerships are so time-consuming. Running these 3 projects simultaneously, and if you actually count the number of organizations that we had to stay in touch with and make sure that we stayed in touch with the lead person in each one of the organizations, and of course there was turnover, it is incredibly time consuming, and I think that frightens people away. But I don't think they get how amazingly valuable having the intermediary and the partners' inputs into our research and making sure that our research is applicable to workplaces.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Emily, what are your thoughts or last thoughts or comments?
I am really happy to have done this webinar, and I hope that people who listen to it learned something. And yeah, it was a great project to interview the research partners on all 3 projects. I myself was only involved with Sun Safety at Work Canada, so it was interesting to learn about the other 2 projects that I wasn't involved in. And yeah, thank you very much.
Well, thank you both very much.
Karen, I just want to thank you because you actually have published articles from all of the projects, including this meta one, and having Work as a journal who is interested in workplace-based research is absolutely fantastic. I mean, it's marvelous. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Well, we're excited about this, and I mentioned before we went on that Work is going to celebrate its 30th year in 2020, and for me,
Congratulations.
oh, thank you. And for me as the founding editor, I feel that it's meeting such an important need in research and understanding cases, scoping reviews, systematic reviews. We really have worked very hard to make it a welcoming journal, and it's our honor to have published your article.
Thank you so much, really.
Thank you.
You're
And thank
exceptional.
you so much.
Take care, everybody.